God's standard of love is the subject I'd like to talk about with you. How many of you feel that love doesn't have a standard? Have you given it any consideration as to whether love has a standard or not? Whether there is a certain things that determine whether something is loving or unloving? Yeah. So most people in the world probably have what I would classify as their own standard of love, don't they? And the problem with me having a standard of love that differs to Mary's standard of love, and that differs from, Nellie's standard of love, and differs from Yvette's standard of love, and differs from Emma's standard of love, and is that now, because we've all got different standards of love, we're all going to basically fundamentally disagree on some things. And the problem with disagreements is quite often, depending on our standard of love, they can even become violent. And this is one of the main reasons why we have war on the planet, is because the standard of love differs for each person in each country. And at the end of the day, you end up with almost everybody having a different standard of love. Right? So if we all had the same standard of love, can you see a lot of our problems on earth would be resolved immediately? We would all be in much more harmony with each other about what to expect in our interactions with each other, but also we'd be much more in harmony too with the environment, because we'd love the environment as well. So we'd be much more in harmony with the environment. There'd be less destruction in the environment as a result of our standard of love. So the main problem the earth faces is that we all have different standards of what we believe love to be. And the problem with that is that for many of us, those standards are not very high in comparison to God's standard of love. So for those of you who've heard us speak before, you know that in the spirit world there are spheres, right? There are basically, you could say spheres are basically delineations. So the first sphere, which is where the earth resides actually at the moment, let's do the first 7 spheres. There are 36 altogether, but let's do the first 7. The first sphere is a standard of love that actually matches the earth's standard of love. So the majority of people, when they pass into the spirit world, pass into the first sphere of the spirit world, because the first sphere of the spirit world is designed in such a manner that it matches the standard of love that we have here on earth. And so when you arrive, there's the least amount of confrontation for your current condition, because you're arriving in a similar place to where you came from. It's just a different place in terms of a dimensional space, but it has very similar characteristics actually to the earth environment, in that the standard of love is exactly the same or very similar to the earth environment. So the first sphere is, you could say, the sphere where most people from earth, and when we say most, we're talking 99.9% of people on earth arrive in the first sphere when they pass. And that standard of love wasn't a standard of love that actually God created. The standard of love that God created, which is the standard of what God has, what we refer to as the perfect natural man. So this is the standard of a perfect person. In other words, without God, the furthest you can progress is to be a perfect person. And that perfect person's condition enables them to live in the 6th sphere of the spirit world, right? So when you pass, that's if you're in a perfect condition of love from God's perspective, without receiving God's love, the 6th sphere is the place where you can live. Now, historically, there's been no one on earth who, aside from myself, no one on earth who's ever passed into that condition, right? And there's lots of reasons for that. And the majority of the reasons are to do with the fact that the earth is in the first sphere condition. And so that means the majority of us are accepting of the earth's condition as a standard of love. And so we don't think or even conceive that we can develop our condition beyond that point. And we'll talk about why that's the case in a minute. So that's the perfect person. And God created all souls, actually, even though they are yet to incarnate. All souls who have ever incarnated have always incarnated and arrived on earth at the moment of conception in that condition, in the sixth sphere condition. That was the condition God created us to be, the perfect natural man. But very quickly what happens is that because of the absorption of the condition of our environment upon the soul of the human, very quickly we degrade our condition. And by the time we're in usually our teens, our early teens, we're already in a first sphere condition, usually. By the time we've made the growth and development of just a few years, if you think about teenager, 13 years, that's not very long, is it? Where you can go from a condition which is very close to the condition most babies are born into is a fifth sphere condition, because they've lived 9 months in the womb already, absorbing the condition of their environment. So by the time they're generally born, they are in a fifth sphere condition, and then as time goes on, that condition usually degrades. Now, for a child, you can sort of understand the degradation because all they're doing is really absorbing the degradation of what's around them. So it's not necessarily a choice on their part, is it? They're just born into an environment which we as humans have created. We created this first sphere condition. And so they're born into this environment that we, the previous generations of humans, have created. And this environment encourages them to become like the environment. And many of you have come to Portugal because you want to get away from that. For those of you who are expatriated to Portugal, you probably have come to Portugal to try to get away from some of the environment, right? That you've grown up with. But unfortunately, quite often what we do then is we create another environment, which is a knee-jerk reaction to the environment we came from, which still has almost the same conditions of unloving behaviour, but just in different ways. So we'll talk about that as well. But in terms of a summary of what happens, all of us have been created without our awareness and without having an individualized spirit or soul. We were created in this as a perfect person, a perfect soul. And in fact, we were created as two halves of one soul. So all of you are only one half of one soul, not a completed soul. A completed soul has two halves. So each half, when it incarnates, so that's when it's first conceived, it incarnates and joins to a spirit body and a physical body. So if I just draw that, and many of you have seen this before, I need a rubber.
Yeah.
That's one thing I haven't got.
Yeah.
Yep. So just bear what I've just written there in mind, and it looks like we're going to bear it in mind anyway because it's not it's not going to come off. So when we incarnate, you could think of the complete human soul. I'm going to draw a heterosexual soul because there are homosexual souls too, but I'll draw heterosexual. You've got the male-female, obviously, in a heterosexual soul, and you've got the male body. Two bodies are actually created at the time of conception. One body is a physical body and the other is a spirit body. And of course, when the other half of the soul incarnates, that half of the soul also incarnates into the appropriate body for its masculinity or femininity. So if it's primarily dominantly masculine, then the bodies will be male. If it's dominantly feminine, then the body, the half of the soul I'm talking about, dominantly feminine, then the two bodies that are created at the time of conception will be feminine, not as a result of the soul, but because the bodies are created through the sex act, and then the half of the soul is attracted to that body based on its femininity or masculinity. Right? So that having occurred for every person who's ever lived and every person who will ever live, this process is for the individualization of the soul. In other words, so that you can recognize that you're an individual and that you have a life to live and to learn and to experience. And each individual is given that ability through this process of incarnation. So before you incarnate, you are not conscious of your existence. You are not self-aware. And as soon as you incarnate, you become self-aware. Now, obviously that self-awareness grows from the time of conception. It grows through experience. So you could say when a child is born, it's hardly self-aware, is it? Most of the time it does instinctual things like poo, wee, eat, drink. It does the basic human physiology functions, and it does that, but it's not aware of itself and the use of its will yet. But of course, after a little while, it learns it can scream, cry, and mum and dad will respond, right? So now it's building some level of self-awareness of, I can, control to a degree the use of my will and have an experience of something coming back to me as a result. And so it begins to have an experience. Then, of course, as its brain develops, because that takes usually 7 years for the brain to develop, as its brain develops, it then demonstrates a stronger and stronger access to its will. And this is why, you get almost by the time of 2 or 3 years of age, many children are quite willful, aren't they? Like, you try controlling a 2-year-old that's got its own will, it's pretty hard sometimes. And this is why oftentimes parents in particular, revert to things like abuse of the child, like smacking the child and other things like that, in order to control its will. Because it's quite obvious to most of us that the will is quite established in that child, and you can't create really a mini-me, a smaller version of yourself, because this person has its own personality and it has its own individual life and it has its own awareness growing that it can develop its own life. And this is how God created it to be, so that each person can learn about themselves. So in the process of that happening, unfortunately, because we're living in an environment which is very, what you would classify as damaged with regard to God's standard of love, the child starts absorbing the standard of love that the environment is in. Now, the only thing that can change that is really the parents growing their standard of love to be higher than the environment you're in. But most parents are not, by the time they become parents, there's no manual, is there, for parenting generally? Not one that I've seen anyway. Is there anyone that you've seen, manual? No. So there being no manual means that at the end of the day, even the parent is learning how to be a parent. So it's quite funny in a way, isn't it? Because you might be 25 and you're just giving birth to your first child, but really you're a just born parent, aren't you? Really, you're not really 25 years of experience of being a parent. This is the very first day the child's born, you've now got an experience of being a parent. So you're a newborn parent as well as having a newborn child. And having that as a part of the process means that you're learning how to be a parent. And that's a part of your education. How do you love somebody? How do you love somebody who's not going to give you anything back initially? That's a part of what you learn from being a parent, right? So this is all a part of your education to educate you in the process of what it means to be loving. Does everyone follow me so far? So God wants you as your primary purpose in life to learn what love is and then to practice it. That's your primary purpose in life. That applies to all of his children, and none of you are accepted from that. None of you. Not a single person who's ever lived is ever going to be accepted from that requirement to learn what love is. And the reason why that is each one of those spheres that we just drew before are conditions of love. And if you want to enjoy the new condition of love, you need to learn what that condition is and you need to understand it to such an extent that you can live there. Otherwise, you can't live there. You have to live in a lower condition of love. until you learn that. And of course, your learning is not governed by anyone else other than yourself. In other words, nobody can force you to learn it. Nobody can even inspire you to learn it. It's something that you must do for yourself, to decide for yourself that you're going to learn what love is, learn how love is to be expressed, and you could say learn the laws of love, because there are laws that govern the flow of love. And your fundamental reason for existence is to learn that, the reason why that is the case is because God made it so that the more loving you are, the more happier you're going to be. And of course, he wants you to be happy. So God has created this system that it's really about learning about love, not your standard of love, or not the world standard of love, or not the social standard of love, not your country standard of love, but God's standard of love. Right? And the more you bring your life into harmony with God's standard of love, the happier you will be. Now, is there any questions you want to ask before I proceed with what's happened to the world about love? Yep. So we have the mic. Anyone? Yep. Just leave your hand up if you.
How are you supposed to know what the next standard of love is?
Very good question, isn't it? Because it's like there's no seemingly. It seems like, particularly living in the world we are in now, it seems like there is no standard. Does that make sense?
And we don't know where to reach to.
And we don't know where to reach to as a result. So it seems like that. But the reality is, if you are sensitive emotionally, you will be able to feel the standard of love very easily as to where that is. So a lot of it depends a lot about what's going on for you with in terms of eternally, as to how you're going to internally measure the standard. Make sense? Yep. Now we might have to dispense with that sound. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so what we want to do is later, and hopefully tomorrow more, we will talk more about how do you find what the standard is. Right? Now, a lot of people sort of believe that God has left them without any help, without any assistance to find out what the standards of love are. But that's not actually true. There's mechanisms that God created in your soul that allow you to hear information from God. And we talked about them in both Brussels and in Austria. And that is the human conscience, which is a mechanism God created in the soul that allows you to receive truth from God. And also, there's a mechanism which you have to exercise. So the human conscience is one that's already there. And then there's a mechanism you have to exercise to receive God's love if you want to know what God's standard of love is. The easiest way to know what the standard of love is to receive love from God, and then you'll know the standard of love that God has about any matter. But if you're not receiving love from God, there's still the operation of the conscience, which is a mechanism that God has for sharing truth with you, right? So you've got the two mechanisms, you could say, that are a part of the half of the soul. So half of the soul has mechanisms. Let's draw them like that. Mechanisms. One of those mechanisms is the conscience, right? The conscience, which is the mechanism via which God shares truth with you. Yep. And the main problem we have on earth is hardly anybody historically on earth has known how it works. So they don't teach children how the conscience works. But if you think about future education, the best course of action would be for even children, young children, to learn, this thing I have called the conscience, I can This is how it works. This is the mechanism. This is its scientific principles about how it works. If we understand the scientific principles about how the conscience works, now we're able to receive truths from God. We can go ask God, how damaged is this environment here? And God can share straight away how damaged it is with me. So he can share the truth. Now, the truth may not affect me emotionally, but at least it will have entered my intellect and allow me to make choices and decisions, right? Now, I can choose to reject it as well, or I can choose to accept it. And most people on earth, with regard to the conscience, at the moment, are choosing to reject it, right? So, unfortunately, there's not a lot of people on earth who are actually in tune with their conscience at this stage, because they're using their own life. They have a strong justification of their own life being how they want love to be, and then they reject the truth coming from God about whether that's true or not, whether that's righteous or not. Yeah. So the conscience mechanism is one of those connections with the soul, and the other mechanism, which is the mechanism that allows the Holy Spirit to connect to you. So the Holy Spirit is God's Spirit. It's like a conduit that transmits love from God to your soul. It is only opened when you have a desire for it. So the mechanism is your passion or desire. And it's what I've called ever since I've been around, prayer. And that mechanism is a mechanism that you have to enable in your own soul if you want to have a connection with God and receive God's love. The desire to pray, which is actually a desire, a passionate desire, a longing for God's love. And God's given us the gift of that love for the last 2,000 years. So in the sense that he's provided its ability to flow into the human soul. But of course, for most people, it doesn't flow because very rarely exercises everyone rarely exercises a sincere desire for it to flow. But these two mechanisms, you could say the conscience is like a rule book, an internal one, like a rule book written inside of you. So God didn't need to provide a rule book because you have the ability to, through your will, to engage a rule book or to not. You have the ability to turn it on or turn it off. Yeah? And when you think about it, it's pretty amazing that ability is there. And every human, by the way, has it. It's a gift given to every human as a part of your soul's construction. Yeah. With regard to the prayer, that's something you have to choose to turn on. So the conscience is there right from the beginning of your life, and it's about learning how to use it. And many of you, when you were younger, had moments when you were using it more oftentimes than you're as an adult. So, I don't know how many of you, when you were young, how many of you actually stole something from somebody, like when you were young? And then how did you feel afterwards? You could feel in yourself you were trying to hide it, right? You were trying to cover it over. You felt it bothered you. And how many of you had to confess? Right? So a few of you. How many of you still feel ashamed to this day? Right? So you can see that there was that mechanism working, that conscience mechanism was working, but because of different emotional reasons, we have a habit over life to turn it off. Right? And shame is a powerful emotion that turns off the conscience, which is an interesting fact. If we have microphone there and then microphone...
Maxine, yeah.
Maxine, on your side. Yeah.
How do I know if I've got a true desire to receive God's love or if I'm just acting out of lack?
It's a very simple way of knowing, and that is if you receive it, then it means you had a true desire. Does that make sense to you? And if you don't receive it, it means you didn't.
Is it something, when you receive it, is it something then constant? or is it something that comes and goes?
Well, it depends on your development, and it also depends on your desire to pray and how often you pray. So for most people, when they begin, they pray very sporadically and very inconsistently, and also with a lot of insincerity, which they have to sort out as well. So an example of that, for many of us, when we pray, we start praying because our life's a mess and we want somebody to come along and fix it up for us, right? Which is a very insincere reason for praying, right? And now, of course, God the Lord, the conduit that connects the Holy Spirit, responds to the sincerity of the person, how much the person is in truth. So if the person's not in much truth, then they think they're praying, but they're not going to be receiving anything, right? But if the person is in a state of truth and also in a state of sincerity, whenever you pray, you will receive it. So if you're not receiving it, it automatically means you weren't sincere.
So shall I still pray then? If
So-
I feel it's not sincere, like shall I still pray? Or
Well, a better prayer would be,
be more honest?
yeah, to be more honest, and also to go, okay, I'm not receiving anything. It means I'm not sincere. How am I not being sincere? What's going on? What's causing me to not be sincere in this moment? A lot of times you'll find it's because you want God to help you get a way out of something you've created, and you want God to now solve the problem that you created, right? And this is very common in most people. They want God to solve their problems rather than they have to learn how to solve them themselves. And so that often makes us quite insincere, because we want like somebody to come along and save us from the creation of our own problems. So we go and create a problem, and then we want, someone else to rub it out for me. And hopefully that's God. And when God doesn't do it, most of us get angry and get upset with God and say, God doesn't care for me. When actually what God's trying to do is teach you how to be self-responsible and learn how to solve your own problems, which is a part of your learning process, right? So yes, so the answer to your question is simple. When I pray and the desire is sincere and the longing is sincere, I will always receive God's love. And by the way, you'll know it every time that you've received something. And as a result of that, you'll be able to measure whether you're sincere or not.
The good thing about continuing to pray is that you get that feedback all the time. Oh, something I need to refine. Still not happening.
Yeah. So if you're praying every day and you haven't yet received divine love, God's love, then you know every time you've been praying it wasn't sincere. So then you go, well, why wasn't I sincere? Like what is the measure of sincerity? What standard does God have?
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think because as a kid still, I would pray when I was scared.
Yeah.
So it was like fear would kick in and then I would pray. So,
That's right.
And as an adult, I keep on doing the same. Like I pray whenever I need God or I need like reassurance or...
That's right. Yeah. And that happens quite a lot. For most people, they only pray when they feel they need God, but they're not in a relationship. If you think about a proper relationship, if I only want to be in a relationship with Mary when I need her, can you see it's not very nice for Mary, is it? Like if that's like, if I want to have a relationship with Mary, it's because I want to love her, isn't it? And I want to like learn about her and I want to do things for her. Like love motivates you to give the gift of your love to others, right? So, this is how you feel when you love somebody. And so when you're just scared and you're in a state, if I'm frightened and I want Mary to make my fear go away, she's now got a role, hasn't she, a job to do that I'm really demanding she does. And that's not a loving concept, really. So we'll talk more about that as the next 2 days goes on, right?
But you're also expressing a feeling of limitation in yourself that you can't handle fear. And God
Which is also
wants
not true.
you to learn that you have the capacity to experience fear.
Yeah.
And you probably find that when you have more faith in that capacity to experience fear and you do experience fear, you can long to God in those moments and you might actually feel God because you're actually in that process of releasing the fear. And God wants you to know that you're capable of doing that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Tim?
You said shame is a way where the conscience will shut down when you feel shame. I don't really understand that. Isn't shame also like a way of the conscience telling you did something wrong?
Ah, well, yes. Now we're talking about two different emotions completely. The second one you're mentioning, where your conscience is telling you, that's guilt,
Yes.
not shame. And what guilt has a number of different flavors to it, but what God's intention is with the conscience for the feeling of guilt is that guilt is just a statement whether you're right or wrong. So, let's say I murdered somebody and I was in a court and they were, having a court case about the murder that I committed, and they asked me whether I'm guilty or not. They're asking me whether I did it, aren't they? Yep. And your conscience is the same mechanism. It's basically telling you, you did that. You did that, right? So let's say, example we gave just earlier about when we stole something when we were little, the conscience is saying, you did that, right? So it's just expressing to you that you are guilty of the unloving act. That's it. How you feel about that guilt could be shame or wanting to fix it, couldn't it? Now, if you feel shame, you're most likely not going to fix it, right? You'll often carry that shame for the rest of your life, but still not fix the reason why you took the act. Guilt is there to prompt you and go, you did it, what are you going to do about it? That's the purpose of guilt, to establish that you did something and it was really something that you did wrong. What are you going to do about it? That's its only purpose, right? It's not to condemn you for the rest of your life and make you feel terrible for the rest of your life. It's just to help you make a decision in your future about what you're going to do about what you did, right? So there's a big difference between guilt and shame. Shame will stop you from progressing in love. Guilt will help you progress in love.
So shame is like an addiction almost, where you want to...
Shame is an addiction that most people have learnt in their childhood because they learnt that if they feel ashamed, their parents got off their back about doing something wrong. So an example of that is, let's say when you're a child and you did something wrong that your parents assessed as wrong. Quite often what your parents will do under those circumstances, because they haven't learned about love, so quite often what they'll do is shame you. So what they'll do is they'll remind you over and over again, you did that, you're a bad person, you did that, you're a bad person. But they're constantly telling you, you're a bad person, you're a bad person, you're a bad person in this. They think that it's motivational, but actually it causes you to just try to avoid doing that thing again, but not be motivated to find the reason why you did it in the first place, right? So it's not solution-based. It never addresses the cause. It's only addressing the effect of your behavior. So that's the trouble with shame, is that all it does is when you feel ashamed, you feel like, I don't want to do that, or I don't want any part of that again. But you never sort out why you did that thing or why you felt to do that thing in the first place, right? And because of that, shame is really it's a very restricting emotion, and you can stay in states of shame for long periods of time and not make any progress. Yeah. Guilt, the purpose of guilt is just to say you did wrong or you did right. Actually, it's not just, the conscience doesn't work just telling you did wrong, by the way. It also works telling you did right. So, oftentimes if you've got a very sensitive conscience and you're doing something, even when everyone around you is telling you you're doing it wrong, if you've got a really sensitive conscience and you can feel from God you're doing it right, you're going to be pretty confident that you're doing it right. Yeah? That makes sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the purpose of the conscience is to show you the difference between right and wrong, right? And to help you feel guilt when you do wrong, so that you at least are aware that there was something wrong done, and then you have the choice to fix that or not. Now, so what most people do with that is they then try to desensitize their conscience by trying to stay away from the emotion of guilt. And the problem with doing that now is I can't tell whether I'm doing right or wrong anymore. And this is where most people in the world are with regard to the use of their conscience. They can't really tell what's right and they can't tell what's wrong. Right? So now they ask for a rule book because the rule book that God created, which was inside of themselves, is not working anymore. Right? So what they do is they go, right, this rule book inside me, I don't want it to work anymore because it feels bad. So what I'm going to do is just go and find a book, Bible. I'll find the Bible. I'll read the Bible, and that's what I'll do, But let's say the Bible's not very acceptable in most Arab countries. So what do I choose then? I choose the Quran. But the Quran and the Bible are not very acceptable amongst most of you. So what do you choose?
Oh,
Some New Age philosophy, right? Some New Age thing which is more acceptable to most of you at the moment. And so you choose the New Age thing. And you go, there's my Bible. You ran to your book or, some other similar book that has been written. And I go, or, what do they call it? I forget all the other books, but there's so many of them that Course of Miracles or something that puts New Age philosophy as the book, the rule, from spirits or something like that. And so I choose that. And then I try to live my life by that. But it's still neglecting the fact I have a conscience and God could tell me directly what's going on, what's right and wrong, if I so choose to develop that conscience. Yeah. If we go up the back there, and then
Maxine had her hand up.
Maxine first, and then up the back. So you start Maxine, and then up the back there.
I think it's a question from a spirit. They were asking, what do you mean by being in a state of truth to receive God's love? And wondered if you had an example.
There are, if you think about your life on a day-to-day basis, there are times when you're quite removed from reality. Does that make sense to you, Maxine? Like where you would like to believe that your alter reality is reality. So an example of that at the moment is the whole world wants to believe that we're heading in the right direction. They want to believe that, right? Want to believe they're more conscious and heading in the right direction. I think it's quite obvious to anybody who's really looking that that's not actually happening, right? Isn't that quite obvious to most of you? It's not actually happening. We're probably heading in the wrong direction. But we would like to believe individually in particular that we're heading in the right direction, right? An example of that is, here's a physical example of that. And by the way, when I bring up examples, I'll bring up physical examples, sexual examples, emotional examples, and spiritual examples. But here's a physical one. I recycle. That's a physical example of how we're not facing reality, right? The reason why are we making things that are getting recycled? Why can't we use them for 100 years? Why are we making things that only last one use and then they need recycling? From a practical perspective and a loving perspective, it's very wrong to make something for a single use, right? Because it's not economical on the world's resources. So by saying to you, but we're going to recycle it, it's also ignoring the thing, what resources are going to be needed to recycle this thing. But if it makes you feel good, that's all most people are worried about.
Yeah.
If they go, well, yes, it's plastic, but I'm going to recycle it. Then I don't have to consider anything else because I think that the problem is solved. But the problem isn't solved. Recycling uses water. Primarily, lots of water, lots of electricity, lots of resources to recycle. Often the recycled product isn't as good as the original either. So what they're finding, like with plastic bottles, the more they recycle them, the more plastic ends up in the water and the more you drink the plastic in the water. So you end up with microplastics when you're drinking. So these are common facts that everybody's ignoring because we want to feel good about using the product, right? And so the motive in that case is obviously bad, but we want to believe it's good. We feel the motive is like, as long as I can sort of virtue signal my way out of my conscience bothering me, right? Because if we were really sensitive, our conscience would bother us about using plastic one time. If we were really sensitive, we'd want to use it over and over and over again. And even then, we'd like to invent something that's not plastic to do the same job. That would be even better, wouldn't it? There's obviously advantages of plastic. If we could invent something that does a similar job, but with all the disadvantages not there, right, then that would be better. But unfortunately, that's going to mean probably the product will cost more. And most of us don't want to pay more.
Yeah.
Right, so we have a lot of issues as to why we virtue signal our way out of our conscience operating.
Yeah, we just put plasters over deep wounds, really.
Yeah.
So
So when it comes to sincerity, so your question from the Spirit was, if we go back to that question.
what you mean by being in a state of truth?
Yeah, so a state of truth says, I am going to face the facts of every single thing in my existence. So physically, that means facing the fact about recycling. It's not actually working. It's not working. It's not something on the planet that's helping the planet. There are whole mountains of so-called recycled product that were meant to have gone through recycling that companies are just going, the people don't know, so we just chuck them in landfill, right? If we face the fact of it, right, and we're honest with ourselves, we can tell you it's not working. How much is the choice of my food? How much is the choice of the products I buy? How much is all of that affecting this decision? You follow me? So an example of that is Yvette thought she was being quite loving buying you some chairs to sit on. You know, it's lovely that you got chairs to sit on, isn't it? The trouble is they're plastic. They're not what I would have purchased, right? The reason why is, and it's no criticism to Yvette, she did it for a monetary reason, right? Yes, right. Not a good reason, but it's true. So and she thought she was being loving to you in giving you a chair, which, by the way, she was, because half of you would be now sitting on the floor, right? Which is more uncomfortable than sitting in a chair, particularly if you're listening to someone rave on for 5 hours, right? So it's loving to have a chair, but it would have been better to buy one that's going to last 100 years. Wouldn't it? Then one might break and then have to go into landfill. You follow? But you can see the motivation for many of us is the same kind of motivations. It's, I want to do the right thing, but it's going to cost too much to do it right. And I'm worried about that. I'm worried. Also, Yvette was worried too that maybe, you know, if she bought chairs for $100 each, that might last the distance versus what are these about? Seven. Yeah. So 10 times the amount, then you guys wouldn't help her out to do that. Now, I have confidence in you guys would help her out, but she didn't have that confidence, right? So she managed to buy, what was it, 20 chairs for $140? Yeah, 140 euro, I suppose that is. When the same amount of chairs, if you bought the right ones, would have cost $2,000. Right, but they'll last 100 years, and can be repairable, and not go in landfill. But we don't want to face, for whatever emotional reasons we have, we don't want to face what is right. So to have a sincere desire, we have to face up to what is right, what is righteous, what is actually true. And most of us neglect what is true for what is expedient.
So to receive God's love, you have to be willing to be in agreement with God.
You have to get into agreement about what God feels is true.
Yes, yeah.
Which is very different to what we feel is right or true.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep. So over here, yep.
Hi, morning. I don't know if this question is still relevant. It was a clarification question.
Yep.
But in the meanwhile, you have spoken still, so I don't... as I understood it, this conscience is like a separate entity. It tells you whether it's good or it's bad.
When you say a separate entity,
Yeah.
it's not really a separate entity, is it? Because it's a part of your soul which is you, it's a part of you, but it does involve God and you. So what God created in every human soul was a mechanism via which God could transmit truth to the human. And the conscience is that mechanism.
Yes.
It's been labelled by humans, not by God, by the way. God didn't name it. Humans named it the conscience.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'll give the example why I had the clarification question you
Yep.
said, as I understood correctly. Everybody in the room could tell that you have done something right, but you feel in your consciousness that it isn't right, right? If I understood correctly.
That's right, because
Yeah.
let's say everybody here may be detuned from their conscience to a large degree. This is what society does. It has a habit, particularly when it's in the first sphere condition, of pulling everybody into the same condition. So what that means is that to live in the same condition, all of us must ignore our conscience to some degree.
Yeah.
Right?
And the question, maybe have to clarify, because you in the example of the chairs, you were thinking what was right, what was wrong. So my question is, what if you have never heard of the concept of stealing? Would then you say, nobody told you what stealing is, but you like in a hypothetical, you take something.
Yep.
Will your conscience then still say you're right or wrong? Because you don't know. Because I heard you
No, it will.
thinking like what the best thing to do is for the chairs, yes or no. So that's the clarification question I
Yeah,
have.
the conscience will inform you about what is right and wrong because it doesn't come from you. The information doesn't come from you. It comes from God. So it's just a mechanism you have in your soul to receive truth from God. So the actual information doesn't come from you. It comes from God. So let's say, and you see this in very small children who've been taught their entire life. Well, most children are not taught at all nowadays. Most people let them just learn for themselves, I suppose. But if you're in a pristine environment where nobody's educating you about, nobody's ever stolen, nobody's educated you about stealing, the very first time you steal something, your conscience will bother you because God is telling you, not because it's coming from you. It's coming from a source outside of you, right? It's a mechanism you have in your soul, but the information is from a different source than you. And so there will always be a feeling that comes with the operation of the conscience which says, that was wrong, right? And it's really up to the human to develop that sense fully. But as I said, the majority of people on earth are never taught about it. You think, imagine if you went to school and the very first thing you learnt was the conscience. So you're 5 years of age and you go to school and the very first thing they start teaching you about is the conscience. How to find out what is true and false. To my mind, it's an incredibly important thing to know what is true and what is false in life. Because if you know it's true, then you can live in harmony with that. And if you know it's false, then you can dismiss it, right? It makes life very easy once you know what is true and what is false. So to teach a child of 5 how the conscience worked would be an amazing part of school, if that became a part of school. But unfortunately, on earth, by the time the child's 5, we've already desensitized it to its own conscience because for the most times it's criticized us before it was 5. You see this happening all the time where a child criticizes the adult for its unethical behavior and the adult condemns or punishes the child for the exposure of that behavior, which desensitizes the child from the operation of the conscience. So you end up, by the time the child's 5, he's already desensitized from his conscience, right? But if we did differently as adults and we taught the child how to exercise and develop its conscience instead, then by the time they were 10, most children would know exactly what is right and what is wrong in every circumstance and situation. You can even know before it occurs, right?
Clear.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Which would be very helpful, right? Like you're 12 and you're just going through puberty, and some adult, responds to you going through puberty in a way that they want to sexually abuse you. If you, in your own mind, could feel this is wrong, I'm going to fight this, then a lot of children would never get abused, right? Because a lot of abuse happens in secrecy. So a lot of children would never get sexually abused as a result of that if they had a connection to their conscience. But unfortunately, most children by that age are quite detuned from their conscience. And so if there is even sexual abuse that occurs, a lot of children will accept it. And this is what abusers know. And that's how they get away with abuse, right? And these are the consequences of us not being connected to a fundamental thing that God gifted to us right from our conception. Yeah.
Thank you.
Make sense?
Yes.
Yep. If we come across here, behind there first. If we go there first, and then forward.
Thank you. I feel like what's happening in me is that there is some kind of a process of self-deceit where there's a moment where you know what's right and what's wrong, but then there is a conscious story on top that kind of hides that very quickly from you.
Yes.
And then you live in a state of distress because the body or something knows inside that there
Correct.
was a lie, basically.
Yeah, very, very, very true. What you're saying is very true. The majority of us, there is emotional reasons why we don't want to accept the information the conscience delivers. So an example of that is, let's say, let's call this this is more of an emotional example, right? Let's say your best friend is married and she cheats on her husband. And you're friends with both of them. But your best friend says to you, don't tell him. So she tells you, but she doesn't tell him. Right? What are you going to do? Now your conscience will say, what does your conscience say?
Tell the truth.
Tell him. If I love him just as much as I love her, he needs to know so he can make some decisions. I need to first tell her, she needs to tell him, and if she won't, then I will, right? So that would be what your conscience would dictate in that moment, right? But what does all the other things say to you? All the other reasonings you might have, what's going to happen? You're going to be, your friend will probably not like you, right? Because if she's asked you to be secretive, and obviously being secretive is not in harmony with truth, right? So it's quite obvious it's not in harmony with truth, but she's asked you to be secretive. If you agree with her secrecy, it's likely she's going to start to feel like you are not a friend anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you want her friendship for whatever reason, and your desire for her friendship is greater than your desire for truth, you'll reason yourself out of telling him. You will. You'll convince yourself
Exactly.
that it's wrong to tell him, even though internally the feeling is I've got to tell him. But with the conscience, it's really interesting because it bothers you every time. So not only do you now feel I should tell him and I shouldn't tell him because of her, and then you reason with yourself, I want to stay friends with her, so I can't tell him. And you reason all that. Every time you see him, what's going to happen? You're going to, the conscience is bothering me again, and so to ignore it, you've got to detune more from it. That makes sense? If you go with your conscience, then you don't have to detune from it anymore, right? Which means that you'll have a stronger connection to it.
In many different situations.
In all different situations, yeah? But you're right in saying that if I have emotional things that I convince myself through self-delusion that I'm doing the right thing, what will happen is the conscience will continue to bother me until I've numbed the conscience out so much that it doesn't bother me anymore. But the problem with that is now that mechanism's not going to work for every other thing in your life.
Yeah.
And that's how most of us become detuned from it. Yeah? Yep. Do you have any more you want to say?
Yeah, so from it almost sounds like there's a confusion about what love is, or there's an image of what love is that is incorrect.
Correct. So the conscience is the truthful mechanism, right? So it's telling you, this is the truth, this is the facts. The fact is, she's done the wrong thing. She cheated on her husband, not told him, right? In fact, not telling him is probably worse than cheating on him in a lot of ways, because it's a truth issue,
Yep.
right? So it's probably worse. So by not being in harmony with truth, she is also not being in harmony with love. But see, most of us think that there are times, if you love somebody, there's time to lie,
That's it.
don't we? So that's the injury, that's the society injury that we learnt, usually in our childhood. If you want to get away with something, what do? Like, what most of us found in childhood was, if I tell the truth that I did that thing, I'll be punished more. So that now gives me a motivation, doesn't it?
Yeah.
To lie more. But if I told the truth and I was rewarded, can you see that would give me a motivation to live in harmony with truth more?
Yeah.
So for many of us, the reason why we don't live in harmony with truth is we were taught from a very young age that lying gets you out of things. Lying is rewarded by everybody just making out it didn't happen, right? And that reward is now motivating your behaviour against the conscience to continue to lie when things get tricky, when things get difficult. If that didn't happen, then you could say you'd probably be more firm, wouldn't you? More upright, and you'd be more direct, and you'd say, I've just got to tell the truth all the time. And actually you'd realise that truth is an aspect of love. And so therefore, unless I'm truthful, I'm also not loving. And that would help me greatly in my future, right? But if I start to think that I can lie and be loving, now there's going to be a distortion of my beliefs about love that now lowers my condition and also is more in harmony with society's condition. Yeah. It's interesting for us, Mary and I, because people ask us questions all the time, personal ones, and we're truthful with them about what's going on. But most people don't want the truth from us. What they want to hear is an agreement with what they thought. That's what they want. And so they get very angry. And many people, almost everybody, there's been hundreds of thousands of people now that have heard divine truth since we've been teaching the last 15 or 16 years. And the majority of those people are not listening anymore because at one point or another, they become angry about the truth they receive. And that's because there is an internal belief in most people on earth that somebody telling you the truth, they don't like you. Right? So there's an internal acceptance that being loving is like soften the blow.
That's it.
Yeah. That would be one of the motivations, wouldn't it, in the example I gave with your best friend cheating, not speaking the truth, firstly to her, but also, see, if a friend came to me and said, don't tell my husband, I'm going to tell you some things, I say, I don't want to hear them then. If you're going to not tell me, and I'm going to tell him. Like, people come to me and say, don't tell Mary this, but blah, blah, blah. And I go, it's too late now. It's like, Mary's hearing it, you know what I mean? She's the other half of my soul. Of course, she's already heard it, really. But, most people are not aware that whatever Mary is going on for Mary, I hear. Whatever, goes on for me, Mary hears. There's no way there's ever going to be a secret. Like, secrecy is against truth. If you think about the concept of truth, there are a number of parts to it. So if you look at truth for a moment, this is a bit of a digression, I know, but we're going to need a rag to clean out.
Something, a washcloth or something.
Blue comes off pretty good. So with each primary quality that we talk about, there are sub-aspects to them. With truth, one of the sub-aspects is transparency.
Yep, E-N-C-Y.
Spelling, not my strong point. Transparency. So if you are not transparent, that means like when you have the opportunity to share truth and you don't take it, you just stay silent, you're not transparent. And so therefore not living in harmony with truth. Simple as that. Right? So secrecy, which is really the opposite of transparency, is not in harmony with truth. Can you see that? Therefore not in harmony with the conscience, not in harmony with God, not in harmony with love. So every time I lack transparency, I'm also lacking truth, I'm lacking love, and I'm also going to damage my relationship with God every time. So this is part of God's standards of love, right? Is one of the standards of truth, which is transparency, openness. I see many of you, when you first meet another person, you feel a bit shy, right? Or a bit sort of reticent to share of yourself. Well, that's actually a sin. It's against truth, right? Because you're not being transparent about who you are, about your nature, your personality, right? This is God's standard. Human standard is you mistrust everybody until they prove themselves over and over again, generally, that they're worthy of your transparency. Isn't it? That's the world's view. And that's why we're all suspicious of each other, for the most part, when we meet each other. You know? But God's view is transparency. That includes emotional transparency. So an example of that is your husband and you are having a disagreement, but both of you are not saying anything. You know those kind of disagreements? Where it's sort of like, I'm sick of having to clean up after Mary, but I'm not going to tell her. I'm just going to go along and
sigh every time you pick something
and every
up.
time, you know, I think I'm being righteous, but actually I'm being completely unrighteous from God's perspective. My conscience should be bothering me, actually, doing that, because the truth demands that I actually say what I feel. So I'd have to sit down with Mary and say, darling, every time you leave stuff around the place, do you see how unloving it is? And, you know, why do you do it? Well, can we work on why it happens? Right? Because then we can solve the problem, right? Yeah. So many of you ladies do this with your children every single day you've had children, cleaning up after them. And I know you think the role of being a mother is cleaning up after your children, but it isn't. Because God's the best mother and he doesn't clean up after you. You make a mess and he expects you to fix it, right? So if you think that cleaning up after your children is a good part of a role of being a mother, after a while, by the time you've done it a few years, right, you get pretty sick of it. Isn't that true? Yeah, which should be telling you that it's not right? But again, we're not transparent emotionally about things, right? We're not honest with the people around us about whether we feel something is loving or unloving. And that lack of transparency means that I am being unloving by doing that. Yeah.
I guess my question is, it starts with me. I'm not honest with myself, so that's the first. And then I'm because I'm already not honest with myself. Then I'm not honest with the other.
Correct.
Yeah.
And then the lie becomes, it feels like the truth for me, but
That's right.
But it's obviously a lie at the start.
Correct.
Yeah.
This is
spot on.
very common.
Very common.
Everybody's doing pretty much that. And that's the benefit of becoming more emotionally sensitive to yourself.
Yeah.
You start to realize, oh, hang on, I just told myself a big lie to get away from how I'm going to feel if I am truthful with everyone around me.
Yeah.
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 Thank
But
you.
you're spot on. You're spot on. It's exactly right. A big problem we have is self-delusion.
Yeah.
Self-delusion, yeah.
Yeah.
So come forward. Yep, you.
Hi. My question is the conscience very similar to intuition? Do you know if you're in a situation or you get a message and you just know something, it's right or wrong?
No, they're two completely separate mechanisms. Intuition is generally your spirit friend, your spirit guide or guardian, giving you their ideas about what's right and wrong. Some of the times they're actually wrong about it too, by the way. That's very different than the mechanism of the conscience, because the conscience is a mechanism between you and God only. It doesn't involve spirits or your own thoughts even. It doesn't involve you intuitively discerning something. Because intuition is a quality of your soul. So intuition can come from yourself, from your own soul, or it could come from the soul of others. In other words, they communicate to you, whether it's spirits who you can't see or someone on earth who you can see, like your partner. They can all help you to exercise this quality of intuition that exists, that you can develop inside your soul, but that is not the same as the operation of the conscience. The conscience is only between God and you, and that's it.
And can you get a direct message from God through the conscience?
Yeah.
And God would say, just this.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
But you're not going to hear it.
The mechanism is by feelings. So the yeses and the nos and the maybes from God, they all come through feelings, not through the mind. So this is where people who become more intellectual generally start neglecting the conscience quite a lot. It has to come through feelings. But yes, you can get... This is how I worked out everything in the first century about what God wanted to do and God's love and receiving God's love. And I started using the conscience at a very young age in the first century. And by the time I was 5, I was pretty much asking God about everything. Even just things about bees and trees and birds and nature. And, I'd go walking along. At that stage, I lived in Egypt, near Alexandria, which is on the delta of the Nile. And there was a lot of life there in there. And I used to just go walking all day. Pretty much my parents didn't know where I was most of the day. And I'd be talking to God all the time. How does this work? What's this? And how does this creature function? Does the creature even have an afterlife or not? Or all sorts of things. Like, you can get answers direct from God on every subject. God wants to answer you. He wants to give you clarity, because God is transparent. He doesn't want to make everything magical and mystical and hard to understand. He wants to make it all clear and understandable, and that's how he is.
Last question. And does love, gratitude and humility help us connect into that feeling energetically with God?
Certainly, particularly the quality of humility. Yep. If you think about the main reason why we don't want to hear things, is because we lack humility. Yep. So an example of lacking humility is that on earth there is a large degree of arrogance. Most people are arrogant by the time they're 5 years old now. It's rare to meet a child nowadays who is not arrogant. Yep. And this arrogance develops by shutting down from emotion, but also shutting down from the truth that God knows the truth. And that you're not your own lawgiver, you're not your own lawmaker, that God is. And yes, so humility as a quality, which also involves a subpart of humility, is self-analysis and self-understanding. These qualities are very important to develop if you want to make sure the conscience continues to work. Now, of course, one thing I must say is men have more trouble with that than women, right? Women are generally more open to their emotions, except for the emotion of fear, I must say. Most women are very closed to the emotion of fear, but they're generally more open to the concept of emotion than men are. Men have been taught for centuries now, millennia, that to be a strong man, you've got to detune more and more from your emotional condition. You've got to ignore pain. You've got to ignore suffering. You've got to ignore emotional pain. You've got to just strive and control. So men generally have more of a problem with arrogance than women, except when it comes to the emotion of fear. then women have a tendency to get very arrogant. So like, but I'm a mother. I should be afraid for my children. That kind of thing. Does that make sense? Yeah. Thinking that it's protective. Yep. Okay. Yep. Just.
I have two questions, one about guilt and one around the conscious.
Yeah.
I'll start with the conscious because I feel it's the bigger one.
Yeah.
So I was vegan from first. It's about veganism and vegetarianism.
Yep.
So I had a period of time that I was vegan and it wasn't healthy for me. So
Yep.
then I went to vegetarianism.
Yep.
And then I have a health issue that recently put me on to eating meat.
Yep.
And it's every time I eat it, my conscious is talking to me.
Yep.
And I find it very, I'm confused just because from a physical point of view at the moment, I need to eat meat, but I know it's wrong. So it's...
Well, I'd say you're in a fear state for a start, aren't you?
I'm in a fear state just in general at the moment.
But if you look at the food issue,
yeah,
you're afraid that if you eat vegan, that you'll get more and more and more unhealthy.
Mm.
Isn't that true?
Well, I've been also told by all these different...
By all these experts. Yeah, you know what an expert is, don't you, T? It's a has-been, drip under pressure, an expert. Right. So they're not. It's like it's people who don't know truth. It's a bad joke, I know, but it's so let's look at your situation.
You down here, Del.
Sorry. Oh, great. Okay. So let's look at the situation. So your conscience told you to be a vegan.
Mm.
Okay. So you could say, here's your soul, you're the feminine half, the conscience mechanism, which is a connection with God, not with anybody else, that's telling you to be vegan. So that should say a lot in itself, shouldn't it? So what does it say if your conscience is telling you to be vegan?
That's the truth.
That's God's truth. He would like us all to be vegan. When we say vegan, many vegans get very aggressive, militant, self-righteous, all unloving things, right? So therefore, God doesn't want that. Right? They get controlling of others. They get bullying. They even go online and they do trolling and all sorts of things to try to encourage others to be vegan. Now, obviously, all of that is completely out of harmony with love, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So completely out of harmony with love. But your connection with God was informing you to be vegan. And in fact, the reality is for most young children, it does as well. So that's what the connection with God's saying. But when you did you got ill. So blue, good, red, bad. Right? So I got sick.
Completely unintentional.
Just for the sake of the drawing, right? So sick. I got sick.
Yeah.
Okay. What did you ask God what the cause of your sickness was?
No, she asked an expert.
No, I didn't ask that. No, but I didn't ask God.
No. And why didn't you? Because you did ask God about the vegan. You were open enough to ask about that. So obviously there is the conscience working, but when you got sick, the conscience stopped working. So what do you think might have interfered with the conscience working in this case?
Well, actually, maybe I did ask now that I'm thinking about it, but it was not around the veganism.
Correct. What was it around? See, what happened was if you did ask God, you would have been informed that it was emotional. There was an emotional reason why you were getting sick when you were eating vegan, and you didn't want to deal with that emotion. So now you want advice from someone else other than God. You follow?
Yes, I do. But I just because my sickness is not only around the vegan. I mean, the veganism was enhancing the sickness in a way.
Well,
Well, but it's
gave
about-
the appearance of enhancing the. It just made you more sensitive to the emotional problem, actually, which you were trying to suppress. And every time you try to suppress an emotional problem, your sicknesses grow.
Yeah.
So when you're a vegan, it made you more sensitive to the emotional problem. You didn't want to be more sensitive to the emotional problem. Makes sense. You're fighting the emotional problem. You don't want to be more sensitive to it. And so now there's a feeling of, I want another answer other than stay vegan and deal with the emotional problem.
But when I started eating meat,
Yes.
and as a kid, I did not have a conscious that there's a problem eating meat.
Yep, no worries.
And it came at a later
age,
stage.
yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
But when I started eating meat, and I liked meat as a kid,
Yep.
I started feeling better.
Yep. I completely understand that. Because you're suppressing the emotional problem.
I don't know what the emotional problem is.
You don't want to know what the God can tell you what the emotional problem is. And this is the thing, is that this is how we detune from the conscience, you see. We go, my conscience told me to do something. I go ahead and do it, and I got sick. That means what my conscience told me was wrong. No, it doesn't. It means there's another problem that we're not asking about, that we don't want to know the answer to. Because that answer would give us more to deal with, more emotional things we got to sort through than we really want to. You follow?
Yeah.
Yep. And so what I notice is a lot of people who choose a vegan diet, and not militantly vegan, but they choose it out of love. They choose that diet because their conscience motivated to. Then a lot of people do get sick, actually. It's well known, in fact, in medical circles, that a lot of people who go onto a vegan diet, initially in particular, get sick over a period of time, and usually within 5 to 10 years. But even earlier, many times, they start getting sicker. The reason why is because the diet now exposes emotions that the other foods helped you suppress. And in doing that, those emotions which you now have to fight, you're not being able to, if you're on a vegan diet, you can't fight them with food anymore, right? Which is a major tool that most people on earth use for suppression. Yeah. So now you have to fight them using just your emotional skills, of detuning from emotion. And for many women, that's much more difficult than men to do. And so then that makes you more sensitive to sickness as a result. Make sense?
Yeah.
Yep. So that's why it happened. But the cause of the sickness,
Emotion.
God's not going, I'm never going to tell you. He's not saying, I just want you to go through this trauma. Like I'm making you feel bad by not being vegan. But also, I'm not going to inform you about why you're sick either. It's not like that. God wants to share these things with you. And like what I've found for myself in this, like for the very first time, so unlike Mary's been vegan or vegetarian almost all of her life. For me, I ate meat 3 times a day up until I was 33, right? So, I ate meat like morning, noon, and night. Yep. And the way things changed really rapidly for me once I started connecting to God again. Things changed really rapidly. As soon as I start connecting to God, the very next meal that I had, which was my favorite meat dish, I went to a restaurant to reward myself for connecting to God. Not knowing, of course. And so I go to his favourite restaurant. It was called Blues. It's in South Australia. And one of my favourite meals was whiting, like the fish whiting. In Australia, it's a very sort of clean fish and everything. And it was one of my favourite meals. And I went there to have whiting, and I vomited the entire meal up straight away, like the entire meal. And I go, oh, that was strange. Maybe I'm sick. No, maybe something wrong with me. So anyway, I still continued on connecting emotionally for the next week. But by this stage in my life, I'd gotten to the stage of, it's a good reward. this is my thinking of what love would do at this stage. It's good to reward yourself with food when you do the right thing. Right? Now I don't do that, but I used to do that a lot. So I went back to the restaurant. My second best meal, but I was still feeling a bit sick from the fish, right? So my second best meal at the restaurant was a roasted leg of lamb, right, that just fell off the bone, and it was had this sort of honey, I don't know, rosemary, honey dressing over it. Anyway, hopefully that gives you a picture in your mind, right? And so I eat that. I vomited that entire meal up within the next 2 hours when I got home. Yeah. And I'm starting to get worried now because it seems like I can't eat meat anymore. So I experiment with it a few more times. And every single time, this is what happened. So now I know, there's something going wrong here. I was eating meat solid 3 times a day up until this point, and now I can't touch a taste of it. Obviously, and it all began as soon as my connection with God got restored. So straight away I asked God, right? Yeah. The answer was no meat. And what about fish? People say, no meat. Fish is meat is the answer to that. From God, by the way. But fish is meat too. So I'm going, okay, can't eat any of that stuff. So egg sounds all right. So the next meal I have is like eggs. And I vomit that up as well. And I asked God afterwards, not before. I could have asked him before, but, stubborn, So you ask him afterwards, and I can't have that either. Obviously my body is now saying I can't have it anymore, which is a good sign, actually. That it's good. But then after that, I started losing huge amounts of weight. I got to the stage where I was I was 80 kilograms, and I went down to 63 kilograms. So obviously there's some other reason why I'm losing all of this weight, right? And then once I started working through that was a lot about loving myself, being willing in an environment to look after myself. There was a number of other issues. Once I dealt with all that, I put all the weight back on again. And muscle back on. I lost muscle, Yeah. Even though I continued to have a vegan diet. Yeah. But if I had gone to the doctor in that time when I was losing weight, what do you reckon the advice would have been?
I feel it's more complex, but it's connected to my health issue, and I don't know. I've been wanting to talk to you about this ask advice about it for a long time, but I'm not sure it's the right now.
No, but what I'm doing now is giving you the principle, because I'm not going to teach you how. I'm not going to give you a fish. I'm going to teach you how to fish here, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to give you the principle that you can apply to your life. God can share with you the reason why the health problem exists.
Okay.
The health problem exists and the reason why the food triggers it is because there are certain linkages between your childhood and food and the health problem. Now, I don't want to say too much more than that, because if I do, when you're not developing this relationship with God where you can find it out from God directly, I'm actually stopping you from learning how to look after yourself on the matter. You follow me? Yep.
Yeah.
So I want to share what I've shared with you is the principle.
Okay.
And now you can decide for yourself whether you're going to apply that principle or not. Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So the other little question was just around guilt.
Yes.
And I was wondering, because you said guilt will tell you that you've done something wrong.
Yes.
I think you said, yeah. But I just had this memory that when I was a new mother, and I was a lot with our daughter and everything, and the first time I left her somewhere, and it was fine and it was right and it was for me to do my thing, I felt guilty.
Mm-hmm.
And is guilt always...
Well, that's not guilt, that's shame, which is a different emotion.
Is it shame?
Yeah, see, a lot of people on earth call guilt shame and call shame guilt, but the reality is guilt is just telling you whether you did something right or wrong. In this case, you did nothing wrong.
No.
So it was shame.
Right.
Now, why would a woman with, I understand it's your first child, was it? that you
One
did
and
this?
only, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Why would a woman who's just had a child feel guilty about leaving it? Well, most of you women can answer this question, surely. Can you feel in society there is a very strong feeling that if a woman has a child, the woman must take care of the child 100% of the time?
Mm-hmm.
That's what being a good mother does.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Now, that is actually an error that exists in society. That's one of the, not God's standard of love, but the human standards of love, right? About being a mother. That error is what caused you to feel shame, which you call guilty for leaving your child.
Well, I really feel like if I go back to it, I was guilty. But I guess I'm mixing it up. Because
Yeah.
This is very common. On earth. By the time we're 5, usually the conscience mechanism is replaced by mum and dad's mechanism, or their sense of right and wrong.
Or society's.
Which is mum and dad are
really mum and
usually
dad's
reflecting society.
Yep.
And it's very common then to feel like, oh, I feel guilt or I feel something is wrong or right, but it's not a connection with God. It's very often the just reflecting what mum and dad would punish or reward.
Yep.
And so it's very important to make that distinction.
So it's actually fear.
Yeah, it's actually fear of mum and dad. And certainly I know...
fear of disapproval, right?
Yeah.
Which is shame.
I actually went through a whole process of really disconnecting from what I thought was my conscience, which was really a reflection of mum and dad's values. And as I established my relationship with God, feeling, oh, wow, a lot of the things that I thought were my conscience bothering me in my early life, it should have been bothering me in the opposite direction. If I was really connected with God, I would have felt things that I thought were right were actually wrong, and things that I thought were wrong were actually right from God's perspective. So it's a process of resensitizing yourself to that sense with God rather than and disconnecting from your parents.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay, straight behind you, actually.
Hi. In terms of consciousness, physiologically, is it the nervous system? Is it working through?
Sorry, say that.
The consciousness.
You mean the process of human consciousness? Is what you're asking about?
Of how?
Or the conscience itself?
Of how God speaks to you. That aspect, that mechanism, conscience.
Yeah.
Is it work through? Is it nervous system?
No. Your physical body and your spirit body are not involved in the operation of the conscience. The conscience is a soul-based mechanism and not a physical or an emotional mechanism, actually. It is connected to your emotions, but that's only because the emotions exist in your soul, not in your two bodies. So if you look at the bodies of an individual, if you think about your soul or half of your soul, so in your case, you're female, right? Half of the soul, you've got your two bodies, which are your physical body and your spirit body. So this physical body, spirit body. There's a cord that connects, if you want to understand it more, there's a cord, a silver cord that connects these two bodies together. It goes from the top of the base of your hypothalamus in your brain down to the base of your spine. This cord is a silver cord through which all information passes between your physical body and your spirit body. And then there is also another cord, which you could probably call, if you wanted to name it, the golden cord, but we don't, in spirit world, you don't name it that, but that's what you could call it. This cord connects the spirit body to the soul so that all the spirit body's functions and facilities, when it's sensory, all goes to the soul as well. So the soul remembers the experience, right? So these two cords are mechanisms via which all the information flows. Now, in your body, in your physical body, you've got what they call the five senses, so sense of taste, touch, and smell, and what else? Hearing, seeing. All of those senses are subsets of the senses that exist in the spirit body. The spirit body has a greater variety of those senses. So the physical body, for example, can only see in what we call on Earth the visible spectrum, which is from just above infrared to just below ultraviolet, right? So those visible spectrums, which start at red and go to purple, right? That visible spectrum is the only colour your eyes are designed to see, right? Anything else outside of those colours is invisible to your eyes. You can't actually see them, right? Even though they're there. So there's all sorts of other wavelengths of light that your physical body cannot see because it hasn't been designed to see them. But your spirit body can see a larger variety of wavelengths of light. So your spirit body has eyes, and it can see way beyond infrared, like lower than infrared and higher than ultraviolet. And so as a spirit, one of the things you'll notice when you pass is you see more colours, because there's a whole lot more combinations of those colours that can be measured by your eyes, and you'll see them, right? So that's an example of how your spirit body has a superset of functionality that your physical body does not have. But all of that functionality, whether it exists in the body or not, gets fed back into the soul so the soul can remember its experience. So when you look at a sunset and then you think about it afterwards, your soul has remembered it, and you can almost, and later you will even learn more and more, you can recreate the entire thing as if you were there for yourself. So you can actually be sitting down, like eyes closed, and picture the entire vista that you observed, because your soul recorded it, right? And so these things are possible in your soul, and it's only the restrictions of the bodies that limit your body's experience of these things. Does that make sense to you?
Yes.
Yeah.
My question, what I'm curious,
Yep.
when I'm around certain people, there'll be like this gut instinct, one way or the other, that I'm calling my nervous system. Like my nervous system speaking to me. Maybe it is, maybe it's not.
Be more descriptive.
Maybe somebody says something to me and I know it's not true. I feel it. I don't know it's not true. I feel it. Something feels different about it. And then, of course, then what happens is I come in and my mind comes in and there's a story. But before the story, that
there's a sense.
Feeling, there is a sense.
Yeah, that is a spirit body sense, right? So all of these senses are all soul-based senses, and they're all expressed through different bodies, right? These senses. So when somebody tells an untruth, for example, the soul emits actually a certain colour, a frequency of light. It also emits a smell, and it not that is sensible to your nose, but it is sensible to your spirit body's nose, right? It emits a smell, it emits a taste even, and it emits a certain light, and it emits you could call it, I suppose, an aura, but it's not the right word really. It's a word that New Age philosophy has developed over time, but not really the right word. But the soul emits these senses whenever everything that you express in your soul emits out of the soul light, sound, colour, smell, hearing even. A sound like hearing, and it's like a wave as well of energy that is emitted. And if you're sensitive enough, when you're talking to another, you can feel all that. Yep.
Is that sense that I'm feeling in that moment, is that God speaking?
No.
No. Okay. So that's not consciousness or that mechanism. That's
not. Don't confuse consciousness with conscience.
Conscience. Okay, so it's not the conscience.
Consciousness, which is something God gifted to all human souls, is the ability to become self-aware, right? conscience is this mechanism via which God communicates truth to you. So they're two completely separate things.
And maybe to be more specific, like sometimes when you feel something in your body, it can be because it's kind of a mechanism that you've learnt over time. Some people feel things very emotionally. Some people have kind of pushed their emotions into their body and it gets reflected in your body. But that's not necessarily telling you the right and wrong with God. It could be reminding you of something from your past that you're afraid of, or just the sense I can feel through these soul and spirit body senses something's not right here, or there's a lack of truth here. But unless you are consciously seeking the conscience, seeking God's truth on the matter, you can't just say that your body's expression of a feeling is necessarily the conscience.
Or is accurate.
Oh, yeah, or is accurate. Yeah. Because sometimes sometimes a person in front of us or around us reminds us of someone where we had a fearful experience and our gut tells us get away, but we might not, that person may not be the same as the person who was in our past.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's 1 p.m. by the way.
It's 1 already, is it? Okay.
Yeah.
Time for a break, eh? Yeah. And so we'll continue this discussion as we go and develop it over the next 2 days is our intention. Yeah.